I am a geek. I'm also nervous because Anjali was nervous. And I should have, being a water supply company, made sure there was water on the stage at TEDXNarimanPoint. By training, I'm an evolutionary biologist, which might make some sense after I talk to you for a few minutes. I also want to warn you that I'm being purposely reductionist in what I say. And I want to start with a couple of stories. I watched a movie a long time ago called What the Bleep Do We Know? And in the movie, a scientist, it's a very scientific movie. The scientist says, in 1492, when Columbus went looking for India and ended up in the New World, what did the Native American standing on the beach see? They'd never seen ships before. So when there was a ship on the horizon, what did it look like? How would they have described it? What would they have named it? 9 years ago, when I came to India, I had a chance to walk through a bunch of tribal villages in Palghar district in northern Maharashtra. And a really fascinating moment, playing with some kids, we had decided to teach each other something. Someone pointed to this idea saying, how about teaching them about elevators? Well, these kids knew what a multi-story building looked like, up to 3 stories. And their question was, when I said, what if you just kept building rooms on top of each other? They said, it'll take too long to get to the top. And when we told them about the levers in an elevator and how it works, you could see sparks flying in terms of possibilities. A few months ago, I was reading a story about the IITs. How many of you are IIT graduates? How many of you sat for the entrance exam? An interesting story. This is economics. In India today, there was a business story that I was reading about how coaching classes for IIT are the biggest business, or one of the biggest businesses currently. Interestingly, we as a country spend more money trying to get into IIT than the country actually spends on IIT. This is true. It's a 6,000 crore rupee market for coaching classes, and the entire budget of all the IITs put together is less than 2,000. It makes you wonder. So, I want to start by saying, this is a picture, and I couldn't find one with rupees in it that they would let me use. So, I believe that this picture defines a large part of our problem with education. It's not about the IIT coaching classes. This is a snapshot of how we think as human beings today. What do we mean by that? Transactions. Everything that we do, and this is where I'm being reductionist, is considered a transaction. I want to take an aside for just a second. Children are born selfish. They cry when they're hungry. They cry when they need to be touched. They ask for things. But somewhere between being born and going to school, they're also extremely compassionate. When a kid falls down next to another child, it's usually a child that says, let me help you up, and a mother or a father that says, we've got to go. When a child walks across an ant on the street, he looks at it with curiosity, or she looks at it with curiosity and makes sure she doesn't step on it. Over time, we condition them. Let's talk about what this conditioning looks like. In Mumbai today, I'm told, there's a year-long waiting list to get into playgroup. Forget school. And we pay some premium or make sure that we do X, Y, or Z to ensure that our children get into that play group. And then we make sure that we spend X amount and Y amount ensuring that our kids are interacting with other kids of X type. And then buy them materials, saying that if you do this, you can get into this pre-kindergarten. And if you get to this particular pre-kindergarten, you'll get into this kindergarten. And if you get into that particular kindergarten, your life is made. And you can probably do well on that IIT entrance exam so that you can get into IIT, so that your life is made, so that when you graduate, you can take one of those jobs that the placement people come to, and if you happen to get the job on the first day of placement, your life is made. And if I take that job for a couple of years, it'll help me get into that other job where my life is really made. And then someday I'll be so senior that I'll be able to start something of my own with enough money in the bank where my life will really be made. What we are teaching people to understand is the way to get something is to do X for Y. It is an arithmetic calculation. It's not always something that is concrete. If I hang out with these kinds of people, I will feel good. If I just get a chance to do this, I will be happy. It is a transaction fundamentally. The idea that I measure something against whether I do it or I feel it, I measure something against something of equal or greater value, and that is how I make choices. So I'm going to borrow a story from this guy named Anna Hazare. Never heard of him before. I heard him say this a few years ago when I had a chance to meet him, and I heard him say it again when he was on a fast in Delhi a month ago. A couple of months ago. I'm not sure anyone heard it, so I think it's worth sharing. He says, people are like a bunch of grains. And you see these grains, they all kind of look a little bit different. They have slightly different shapes, slightly different colors, slightly different edges. And what do we do with grains in India or any part of the world? We take them to the mill. And when they're done with the mill, they look something like this. Every slightly different grain now is in pieces that look almost exactly like each other, of the same shape and size and formation. And they have a logical conclusion in their life cycle. And that life cycle ends like this. And it ends up somewhere, hopefully in a sewer if we get those built at some point. But then he says, what actually is the logical conclusion of a grain? It's a seed. What do you do with seeds? You go to a really dirty place, like this, it's dirt, and you plant it. And soon enough it looks something like that. A lot bigger and a lot different than it looked before, but growing organically. And then eventually it might look like that. And it might grow in some obscure, crazy place where somebody might not even stand. And it might give you things like this. Or this. Or this. Or this. But he says, Anna Hazare, that it's not good enough to be a tree. Because when things like this happen, and there are floods, really, really arrogant trees get ripped out of the ground from their roots. So what you want to be is a blade of grass. When it gets wet, it just sort of folds itself down. And when the sun comes back out, it stands back up, straight and pointing towards something that gives it life. He calls that namrata, humility. So what I want to talk to you about is this idea of living beyond the transaction. In NarimanPoint language, they would call that tree value creation. I'd like to call it something else. Unconditional value creation. Where arithmetic doesn't work. You can't add the number of things you gave to a seed and expect it to look like that tree. Unlike the number of things you do to get into IIT. To me, this is the root of leadership, the real kind of leadership. Not the kind that did X number of things to get in a position as CEO of Y. But the person who's CEO of Y that says, I'm going to do this just because it makes sense, like give all of their employees the right kind of benefits and therefore create a happy culture. Or the country that is a neighbor to us in the East that decides instead of gross domestic product, they're going to measure gross domestic happiness or gross national happiness. Doesn't make any sense. Or the Anna Hazare who says, I want to fight corruption to 4 people and ends up having 40 million people following him by deciding not to eat. Try that, NarimanPoint. Right? Don't eat for 18 days and have 40 million people follow you. It's not a transaction. The root, to me, of our educational challenges lie in this fallacy that where you want to go can be measured against where you are going and what you're willing to give up for that. To put this in another context, when I had a chance a few years ago to attempt to sell to a number of wealthy industrialists in India the idea of spending philanthropic money on building a large university, a very wise person said, you don't build a university for today, to meet the demand in the market today. You build a university for where you think there is going to be demand 25 years from now. I want you to think about that because somebody built something to make us think about where we should be 25 years from then. Or make it 40 years or 50 years. When my parents went to school and became engineers because they knew that those are the kinds of jobs that were going to give people life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Or when someone said you should have lighter skin and wear that skin cream they put on Star TV so that you can get married. Hey, someone decided a long time ago that this is what we're going to need, and we're living out that idea, that education system that trained people for what the world needed today, but started then. Which all around the world we're trying to figure out what's wrong with this system. How do we fix it for today so that the people we have today can compete? Yes, that's important. But when we're thinking about this problem, we need to be thinking about what kind of society do we want 25 years from now? What role do we as a country, as a municipal corporation, as an NGO, play in helping build that so that our communities are either competitive or, more importantly, following the path of unconditional value creation? So the question is 25 years from now, are we supposed to be the same as China? Is that the transaction? If we do these things, build these schools, build these institutions, build these roads, get a metro to the middle of nowhere, they will come? Or could we be thinking, here is what is possible. An India, or an America, or a Sudan that looks like this. How do we get there? That is the definition of education. Is giving people the ability to imagine the 10-story building in the elevator, or to give the name that they feel like giving to the ship that they've never seen before. We like to think we know everything. And therefore, this finite world of information and knowledge can be traded like the stock market. And people will pay a value for X because they're going to get Y. But really, there's a long way to go. This is where the evolutionary biologist in me comes out. There is a long way to go. There are things that are yet to be unnamed, yet to be created, ways of living that are different, cultural practices that are somewhere beyond what we know how to do today, that live for reasons that are somewhere advanced from why we live today. That is our job as leaders, as teachers, as guides. You know, when I had my first job as a teacher, my principal, a wonderful man named Charlie Sposato, had this cartoon on his wall, and he blew it up. And it was a picture of a child with his head cut off like this. So it was open. And there's a teacher pouring a pitcher of water in his head, which I wish I had. And the argument was that that's not education. On the second side of this was another graphic. It was a cartoon where there was a teacher following a student up a mountain, carrying a stick where the student was pulling him up. Think of that as imagery. To give you another example, Sam Petroda, another famous person that you may know, tells a story that I may be paraphrasing, of when he went to college in America. And he went to an engineering school here in India, and he said, you know, the first day he walked into this engineering classroom somewhere in Illinois, and the professor was trying to solve a problem on the board. And he couldn't figure it out. And the professor knew that there was a smart student in the classroom that might be able to figure it out. And he called on him and said, hey, can you help me finish this? And the student gets up, goes to the board, starts solving the problem. The professor sits down in his seat. Sam Petroda said he fell out of his chair. He said, if I were in India, the professor would have told me that whatever he was doing was right. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But as a visualization, to think about this idea that it is a collaborative effort towards a future that we can't explain, but we will co-create, is a function of living outside of transactions. Outside of saying, I need one teacher for every X students. I need X lakh teachers to be able to solve the education shortcoming. Those are all mathematical calculations. It's arithmetic. So I'd like to end by saying that my version of what progress means lies beyond this idea of a transaction in terms of the way that we think. Last month I had dinner with my brother-in-law and his wife, and they spent 3 hours telling me how the American education system was wrong. And it was in America. And I thought about it from my perspective, saying everybody's saying this about their country. They are. I mean, it's the greatest problem, human rights, civil rights problem in America. By measures, it's probably bigger here when it comes to inequality. But it's equally a problem. And if you go to Africa, they say the same thing. And if you go to China, they say the same thing. There are few countries where someone will say to you that we've got education down. Why is that the case? I don't have an answer. But I will tell you this, if we try to calculate it with measurable transactional science, a year from now, we're just going to be adding numbers and pluses and minuses and division signs and square roots to that equation. The answer is somewhere outside of that calculation. How will it happen? Is when more people start doing things that don't make sense. When more people choose to do what their parents told them not to do, like Teach for India. When more people say that I'm going to take this job and take this career path because it is what I was meant to do and I feel like doing and care about. When more people choose to do more than they're required to do to get to the next spot on their graph of life. And more importantly, when we support that. When we as a community and as a society say, this is something we value. That's my belief. And that's what I was here to share. So thank you very much.